Welcome back. Today we're doing a deep dive into a book that, well, really changed things for a lot of people's understanding of American history. D. Brown's Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee.
Hmm.
So our mission here is first to unpack the book itself, its history, its massive impact, and then maybe broaden out a bit to see how indigenous communities today are, actively reclaiming their own stories, their legal systems, their identities. It's not just looking back, it's about what's happening right now, this ongoing resurgence.
Exactly. And that connection to the present is so important, I think. Understanding that history that Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee brought to light, well, it's still shaping conversations all over the world about Indigenous rights, about justice. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
About those links between what happened then and the realities now.
Okay, so let's get into it. D. Brown's book, 1970. A huge bestseller. I mean, the numbers are staggering. Over 5 million copies sold. And it's never been out of print for 50 years. So you have to ask, what was it? What made this book hit so hard and stick around?
Well, I think a huge part of it, maybe the core of its power, was Brown's approach. He decided to tell the story from the perspective of the indigenous peoples. That really turned the standard historical narrative on its head, challenged those sort of romanticized frontier myths that were so common back then.
Right, the sort of cowboys and Indians narrative.
Exactly. And he wasn't just making it up. He used documented evidence, historical records, firsthand accounts. It resulted in this raw, just unfiltered story of betrayal, immense suffering, but also resistance. It's described as a grim tale of genocide, a heart-wrenching account of atrocities. Hard to ignore.
And it gets specific, doesn't it? It talks about the systematic displacement. So many tribes, Navajo, Santee Dakota, Hunkpapa, Oglala Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, just across the board.
And treaties, like the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868. That's a key example in the book. It set up the Great Sioux Reservation, 60 million acres. Promises of food, education, support, in return for peace.
But the reality was very different. The book shows how conditions on the reservation were less than ideal, to put it mildly, and those promises, those treaties, just broken over and over again.
Yeah, and looking bigger picture, the cultural impact was just huge. It really helped make the modern and historical plight of the American Indian more visible, especially to white Americans. And the timing during the Civil Rights Movement, which was broadening its focus, to support various people of color, that was significant too.
You still see that impact today, right?
Yeah.
Online, people talk about it being mandatory reading. That word heartbreaking comes up again and again, how it fundamentally shifted their view of history.
Absolutely. It struck a deep emotional chord.
Now, an interesting detail our sources mention, D. Brown himself. He was white, librarian from Louisiana and Arkansas. And that, well, it raises important questions, doesn't it? About who tells whose story, especially histories involving such deep trauma and marginalization.
It does, and it's a conversation worth having. The sources acknowledge this common feeling that maybe being Indigenous offers a unique sort of insider insight into these events, which, isn't always a standard applied to historians in other fields, but it's a valid point here. On the flip side, some readers felt the book wasn't perhaps fully balanced or maybe lacked some complexity.
How so?
Suggesting it might sometimes portray Native Americans primarily as victims, which is, a complex issue. And it's really important, as the sources stress, to remember Wounded Knee wasn't the end of Native American history. A horrific low point, yes, but not the final word.
That's a crucial distinction. And that history is ongoing. Our sources point to things like the Wounded Knee Survivors Association, descendants still working today to preserve that history, reclaim artifacts from museums even. That fight continues.
And other controversies linger, too, like those Indian Wars streamers on U.S. Army flags. Many see that as, basically glorifying events like the Sand Creek Massacre. It's still a raw nerve.
So the book's legacy is complex, but undeniably powerful and still relevant.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, thinking beyond just victimhood, it's vital to recognize Indigenous peoples also as, warriors in the historical sense. They effectively challenged forces with superior technology. Their knowledge of the land wasn't just about survival, it was sophisticated strategy. It was sustainable living.
Right. There's that tragic irony mentioned with the Nez Perce helping Lewis and Clark, only to face terrible treatment later.
Exactly. A frittered away opportunity, as one source put it. A chance to integrate that deep knowledge, that culture, into the national fabric that was just lost, a tragedy.
And this resilience, this warrior spirit you mentioned, it seems so deeply tied to storytelling in indigenous cultures.
Oh, fundamentally, storytelling isn't just entertainment. Our sources frame it as a primary means to pass on knowledge over generations. It's a core part of cultural and political resurgence.
How did that work exactly? Reclaiming the story.
Well, it's about owning your narrative rather than being defined or, storied by others, especially in response to colonial powers that historically controlled and shaped the stories about indigenous peoples. Storytelling becomes an act of self-determination.
That makes sense. It's about taking back control of identity.
Precisely. And that directly supports what's called cultural continuity, keeping traditions alive, connection to land, beliefs, language, all of it. This isn't just about nostalgia, it's a vital resource for community well-being. It's even cited as a protective factor in suicide prevention among indigenous youth.
Wow. So it's literally life-sustaining.
In a very real sense, yes. It helps counter that long history of oppression, rebuilds connections to roots, strengthens identity.
There's a really touching example of this in the sources, actually. A young man from the res describing, simple things. Community events, family time, building forts, hunting with his dad and grandpa. And it just paints this picture of strong intergenerational bonds, especially between the men and the family. A real sense of belonging that offers comfort and strength even when things are tough. It's that continuity in action.
And speaking of preserving narratives, we should probably mention Black Elk Speaks, another really significant text. Published way back in 1932, it recorded the words of Black Elk, an Oglala Lakota holy man.
He witnessed some incredible history, didn't he? Lil Horn, Wounded Knee, even toured with Buffalo Bill.
He did. An extraordinary life. And that book is credited with preserving so much Lakota spirituality and tradition. It really helped bridge cultural gaps, offering insight to both Native and non-Native audiences.
Another powerful example of story-preserving culture. Okay, so individual stories, community resilience.
Yeah.
How does this scale up? Because this story of resilience, it seems to reach the global stage too, right? Like with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRP from 2007.
Yes, absolutely. UNDRP is huge. Our sources call it a cornerstone for Indigenous rights globally. Now, technically, it's soft law, meaning it's not legally binding in the way a treaty might be.
Okay.
But its influence is undeniable. And what's really telling is that the countries that initially opposed it, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the US, they've all since endorsed it.
That's a significant shift. It signals a growing international acceptance of these complex rights, doesn't it?
It really does. It marks a major step forward in recognizing Indigenous peoples' rights on the world stage.
Which brings us, I suppose, to the ongoing struggles, the modern efforts to assert Indigenous legal orders, especially thinking about Canada, for instance. Historically, Canadian law has actively tried to, dismantle Indigenous governance and social structure.
Very deliberately.
Outlawing ceremonies like the Sundance, potlatch,
Right.
even stopping people from hiring lawyers for land claims without government say-so. And judges, our sources say, often dismissed Indigenous culture as ignorant or savage, just blatant disrespect.
And that dismissal of Indigenous law, ways of knowing, ways of governing, it ran deep in the settler legal system. Think about that Delgamuukw case in 1991. The judge literally called Gitsan and Wet'suwet'en oral histories and ceremonial dances crude evidence.
Crude evidence. Wow.
Yeah. I mean, that decision was overturned later, thankfully, but it really highlights how these systems just ignored or couldn't even comprehend Indigenous legal thinking. It raises that fundamental question, about the bias against unwritten legal traditions. What counts as real law?
But things are changing now. Contemporary Indigenous artists and writers are pushing back.
Definitely. Creative works are actively challenging those old stereotypes and actually articulating complex legal ideas in really innovative ways. Take Eden Robinson's novel Monkey Beach. It's a Hazler writer using, the crime fiction genre.
Oh, yeah, interesting approach.
Yeah. And through that story, she conveys aspects of Haislan Nuam.
Nuam once said exactly.
It's described as a philosophy of life, a set of traditional rules for behavior. But it's not static. It's an adaptive legal system. It guides how people interact with each other, with the land, with the spiritual world. Robinson uses the novel form to explore how Nuyum helps make sense of things, find solutions, restore balance outside of state courts.
So law embedded in culture, in story.
Precisely.
Uh,
And it's living, adapting. Another powerful example is the Jeepskalaks totem pole. It was stolen back in 1929, finally repatriated in 2006 after years of effort. And that whole process, the negotiations, the ceremonies involved, it was seen as an act of justice on Heisla terms, using both Western legal tools and Heisla protocols.
that's incredible, a real reclaiming of justice itself. And this isn't just the Heisla, right? Other nations, too.
Oh, yes. Our sources mention Inuit legal orders being revitalized as well. It's not just one thing called Inuit law. There are different aspects. Malagay, which are sort of rules for doing things right. Pikojak, which are like authoritative requests or guidance, often from elders. And Tirigisi, specific rules you have to observe, where breaking them can have serious consequences, not just socially, but cosmologically.
Cosmologically. How so?
Well, it connects human actions to the wider world, the environment, the spirits. There's a film mentioned, The Journals of Knud Rasmussen. It explores Inuit customary law through specific stories, like a sanctioned killing of a traitor or someone confessing a hidden miscarriage. These acts aren't just about individual punishment or guilt, they're about restoring cosmological order, healing the whole community, rebalancing relationships with the non-human world.
That's a much broader, more holistic view of justice than we usually think about in Western systems.
Absolutely. It's focused on relationships, human, land, spiritual, not just on correcting individual wrongdoing in isolation.
So, bringing this right up to today, these revitalized legal orders, this deep cultural understanding, how does it connect to current issues, like mass incarceration?
That's a stark connection made in the sources, describing prisons as potentially the new residential schools for Indigenous peoples, given the devastatingly high incarceration rates.
A really chilling comparison.
It is, and it points to why the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action are so critical. They specifically call for more Indigenous-run healing lodges and for recognizing Indigenous legal orders as full partners with the Canadian legal system. The goal is to create genuine alternatives to prison, approaches rooted in healing, community, and those traditional legal principles.
And this is where some of that creative work comes back in, like comics and animation.
Exactly. It's fascinating. Indigenous sequential art comics, graphic novels, animation, they're acting as important legal thinkers. They're participants in these legal revitalization movements.
How does a comic book do that?
Well, take The Outside Circle. It's a graphic novel that looks at Indigenous-run rehab centers. But it reframes rehabilitation not just as individual treatment, but as a collective community effort to heal intergenerational trauma. It's about finding belonging again. Or there's a comic called Three Feathers. It explores restorative justice through land-based sentencing.
On-base sentencing.
Yeah, youth learning traditional skills like moose hunting as a way to make amends, learn peacemaking. It also subtly critiques the pressure sometimes put on victims to forgive. It's nuanced. And then there's an animated short, How to Steal a Canoe.
Okay.
It's got this sort of abolitionist vibe. It uses the metaphor of a canoe museum as a prison. And liberating a young canoe becomes an act of fugitivity, of reclaiming connection to homelands. It embodies this Anishinaabe concept, Daibinindizoan.
Dive into that. Can you unpack that a little?
It's basically freedom, but understood differently than in the West, not as individual autonomy or separation, but as healthy interdependencies with community, with land, with all beings. So liberating the canoe isn't just escape, it's restoring those vital connections. These works aren't just telling stories, they're doing legal work, imagining different futures.
Wow, what an incredible arc we've covered in this deep dive. From the historical earthquake of Dee Brown's book, really shifting the ground, all the way to these vibrant contemporary ways. Indigenous communities are revitalizing law, culture, identity through art, story, practice. It really underscores that these aren't just historical footnotes. They are living, breathing frameworks for resilience, for self-determination, shaping today and tomorrow.
Absolutely. And maybe that leaves us and you listening with something to think about. How can creativity, how can these embodied practices like storytelling and art continue to be such powerful forces in shaping and challenging legal systems? Perhaps it encourages us all to engage more deeply with these stories, these perspectives, to foster, a greater understanding and respect for the diverse legal orders, the vibrant cultures, the enduring wisdom of Indigenous peoples around the world. Their presence is not just historical, it's deeply now.